Welcome to session 3. This week is on Gnosticism. This topic bleeds into several other topics that we'll likely be covering throughout the course. Ancient Gnosticism is not necessarily one belief. It is an assortment of beliefs that all fall under one type of blanket term. Gnosis is Greek for knowledge, and Gnostics would be those who know, in the same way as we would use the word pagan, whereas pagan just would mean people, the people's religion. When it comes to Gnosticism, it's very tied to Hermeticism. It's very tied to Judaism. Christianity especially is a very close resemblance to it. And we also see different aspects of paganism included too, which we'll get to. Two other terms that go very hand in hand with Gnosticism is Manichaeanism and Valentinian Gnosticism, which is a different type of branch. As far as we can understand it, Gnostic before this century was basically was only known to us as a heretical religion. We would only really know about it based off of commentary of old church fathers that would quite understandably speak very ill of them. And only by grace of what is referred to as the Nag Hammadi library did scholars or anybody really learn anything more about it. This library was found in 1945, which it's not much of a library it is now, but what it was 13 leather-bound papyrus codices. They were buried in a jar. Hold on one moment. They were buried in a jar in Egypt and were discovered and subsequently passed through the black market in several hands. These were the Gnostic treatises, which would also be belonging to what is referred to as the Corpus Hermeticum. So we could find both Gnostic literature and even other things like an alteration and a different translation of the Plato's Republic. So this is what is referred to as the Nag Hammadi library. So in regards to Gnosticism, we find, one moment please, we find some specific texts pertinent to understanding this actual religion, as they call it. The Apocryphon of John is one that we're going to be focusing on a lot. Another called On the Origin of the World, the Apocalypse of Adam, and another being Genesis and Gnosis, which there are a few more that I'm not mentioning. Other ones that are not as deep knit but are kind of related to Gnosticism would be different texts, one of them called the Gospel of Truth, the Treatise of Resurrection, the second treatise of the great Seth, and Seth is going to be a very important figure here, and the Testimony of Truth. Now, other works are somewhat related, being that there aren't canon Christianity. So one of the biggest ones is the Gospel of Thomas. This one was discovered in the same jar, the same sealed jar that I've been mentioning. So just as a little bit of a flavor of what this would sound like, this is a quote from there. The disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us how our end will be." And Jesus said, "Have you already discovered the beginning that you are now asking about the end? For where the beginning is, there the end will be too. Blessed is he who will stand at the beginning and he will know the end and not taste death. So this isn't a necessarily heretical text. This would be one of the closest ones to being accepted in the greater canon, but that's a whole nother discussion. There's one more add-on that's going to help me explain Gnosticism, and that is what was found later. Mind you, they found the jar in 1945, but in Geneva in 1983, on the gray markets, as it's referred, they found the Gospel of Judas. And this would most notably be more heretical because, as classic Christianity understands, Judas is the ultimate traitor. But this text actually makes Judas the secret hero of the story. I'll give you a little quote before I go on any further. When Jesus is introduced, he asks if any of them know who he is, and Judas says, "I know who you are and where you come from. You are from the immortal realm of Barbelo," which that's an important term, and we'll come back to that, Barbelo. "And I am not worthy to utter the name of the one who has sent you." As another context, there's this great discussion of what the priests have done with religion, how they've run amok with it for money, for pleasure, for these things. And in reaction to this, Jesus says, "Those you have seen receiving the offerings at the altar, that is who you are. That is the God you serve, and you are the 12 men you have seen." So right here, it's distinguishing that they are serving that God and not another. So here's the kind of beginning of where we can start to dissect what Gnostics believe. In this case, it was seemingly that Judas knew who Jesus was and was willing to make the sacrifice of being made into the traitor in order to help him along, which at the end of this, I'll talk a little bit more about. But before we dive into the cosmology of Gnosticism, I'm just going to give some more context as to the history. So like I said, there were different types of Gnostics. They're all under one umbrella term. And the one that still has some recognition is the Cathars. And the Cathars it comes from a Greek term, katharos, which means unpolluted or pure. They were essentially Gnostic, but they were a specific type. They believed in two gods. One was malevolent, I've always had a hard time with that word, evil, and one was good. And one was in charge of all material things, and the other was in charge of the invisible. And so the atrocities that the God did in the Old Testament would have been at the hand of this evil God or the material God, whereas the Cathars only worshipped the benevolent God and the invisible God, which we'll explain that some more later as well. So the Cathars were definitely the most hunted. They were historically all killed in their encampments. They believed such crazy things as that everybody should be capable of reading the Bible, which the Catholic Church did not agree with, and that the Catholics went so far as to say that other people shouldn't even put their hands on a Bible. And so the Cathars were much more secular in this way, but they were all eventually, through a series of time, eventually were completely done away with through torture. Anybody who worked with them or helped them was also a heretic, and those that didn't speak against them were also heretics. An interesting point here that we want to establish is that the Cathars and Gnostics believe that there are three different types of people. There are terrestrial people, which are the Hyletics, that are ruled by the body. Then there are the psychic people, and they are ruled by the soul and the spiritual. They call them pneumatic. And then there are those purely ruled by the spirit, and those would be true Gnostics. So at this point, that's kind of a spread of the historical context. You have something that's so similar to Christianity that it's using its source material and that it's contradicting what would become mainstream Christianity. So I'm going to lay out the cosmogeny that the Gnostics believe, and we only get this again thanks to the fact that we discovered these books that were hidden. These books were hidden when time was becoming short for them. So this was an attempt to literally bury the truth as they were to see it. So the cosmogony is going to get pretty deep. It's taking inspiration from everything. So mind you, instead of taking the doctrine of Jesus and Christianity and making it its own thing, this is more of the idea of using paganism, of using Judaism, of using certain aspects of Hindu, and the newfound Christianity, and having it all be mixed into this greater fabric of truth instead of just choosing one side. And we can look at it like that, or we could say that this is a religion that is the core of these different religions. So we're going to start from literally the beginning. And this is what the Gnostics refer to as the pleroma. This is a realm of light, as they refer to it as. So just like in the Kabbalah, it starts with this parent of the entirety. This is a mother father aspect. This allness began to think after a long duration of time, began to think, and it had only itself to contemplate. And this contemplation is what personified an entity called the Barbelo. And the Barbelo is the image of the parent of forethought or of thinking. So the God or the mother father aspect, the entirety, made an image of itself. This is really analogous to the Kabbalah. This is what they call Kakman in the Kabbalah. God making an image of itself in order to perceive itself. So once the parent deity began thinking and contemplating, it also started to differentiate different intangible aspects of itself, different concepts. Each of these different concepts were called aeons, which is a term which means like eternal. So it started to create different aeons, different eternities, incredibly long spans of time, and being in their own rights. So the Barbelo is what led to the first aeons. The aeons would be named things like, or have embodiments of things like prognosis, incorruptibility, eternal life, and truth. So these are high value statements, the highest of value statements. The next beings to manifest were requested to the parent entity by the Barbelo. So it was requested by the image of the entirety. And this is only going to make more and more sense as we move along. And it conceived a few more, another entity to embody it so that it could be perceived by what is to come. And this is what the third aspect, which is called Christos. So this is what the Gnostics refer to as Christ, or the anointed one, or the self-originating one. And it was born of itself. So this is the intermediary. So there we have the Trinity. We have the thing, we have the image of the thing, and then we have the kind of distillation, which is the Christos. Um, so this is the point of veneration to the Gnostics, up in this realm of things, purely spiritual realm of things. And this is the in their mind, the ultimate divinity that the human mind can comprehend. And just like the Jews, they believe that the human mind cannot comprehend the greater God. And just like the early Greeks would believe in a greater God, but they felt that there was no right to speak on it, that they could only speak of the pantheon. So we can see how all these things are interrelated. The exception here is Christianity in its way that it wishes to personify and anthropomorphize the God. So there's the three, and this would stand for the intellect, the will, and the word. You know, in the beginning there was the word, and the word in this context is what they refer to as the logos, which, if you want to look into that, that has a tremendous history to that term. So from this, Christos created the great luminaries. So they're like the ions, but they are pervading other realms. So they take on names that you would kind of, that sound reminiscent of Judaism and sound reminiscent of uh, a regular angel names. So there's Harmonzel, Oriel, uh, Diuthe, and Eleth. Um, so aspects like perfection, peace, wisdom, intelligence, love, ideal form, afterthought, perception, memory, loveliness, truth, and form. So these are the fundamental forms of what would later become embodiments in the universe, but they are not embodied. These are the kind of creations of the values. If we were kind of more of the nerdy types, then you would see something similar in the Silmarillion of J.R.R. Tolkien in creating the cosmos that would later become the Lord of the Rings and so forth. So with these created, this led to a distillation which would be referred to as the celestial atom. So with all these archons, or all these kind of creative forms, they thought up, or they created the kind of concrescence, the kind of full form of a being to encapsulate all this. And this was celestial atom. So this is man's true place, as the Gnostics believe it to be, within the pleroma. And as we'll come to see, when materiality and the physical cosmos is made, they view this as, quite reasonably, as we'll see, as an abomination. This should not be the case. We belong in this pleroma along with these other beatific entities. But we'll move on for now, and then we'll try to bring it back. But the important thing here is that the true place, or the idea of the true place and the true embodiment of man, was already conceived of in the realm of the spirit before the universe was ever created. That's the idea. So in Act 2, the very last eternal or further archon that was created in the other realm was Sophia. And to those of us that know, Sophia means wisdom. So this is the goddess of wisdom. And Sophia wished to create as the immortals did. She saw up the ladder and could see how the father-mother aspect could create. And she had what they refer to as an avarice or an envy for this aspect of creation. So she wanted to do so, but in this realm, the only way that you could create is with your opposite, much like we do here, masculine, feminine. And her lover at the time, or her opposite, was unwilling to create. So she went ahead and tried to do a self-conception like that which was done with Christos. And in this, created to what the Gnostics refer to as an abortion, and that is the demiurge, as it's referred to as. Um, I think it's like Aldabaoth. Aldabaoth is the name that's used, and it was born deformed and blind. And by blind, it means without gnosis. And again, gnosis is the light; it is the divine spark, or what we can understand as consciousness. And insane. It was insane. And with great shame, she attempted to get rid of this right away. So, in her experience of seeing the demiurge, of what she had given birth to, she experienced a series of emotions which were along the lines of horror, disturbance, shock, um, uh, great pain, and this came to codify the demiurge and would be carried with him into the void. Um, and this is the point where material creation was made. So there is what is in the spirit realm to the Gnostics, and this is when the demiurge enters into the void. And when it was moving into the void, it got a final vision of Sophia and the greater pleroma, and managed to steal some of the divine light with it when it was moving into the void. So at this point in Act 2, we have the kind of severance, the artificial severance from the spirit world into what is going to become the material universe of which we now inhabit. And so right away, the scale that I'm giving you, that the Gnostics understand, is already a huge scale in comparison to classic Christianity. But anyhow, so the demiurge is now alone in the void, going insane. And since it's there alone in the void and it knows of its faculty and has the divine light, it believes that it is the God. It believes that it is the only God, that it is the thing. And so with this, it moves to create in the void, and it creates the 12 great archons, which are the constellations, and they all have their different names and their different personifications. And then it moved to make the next 7 archons, which would be the planets, or the planets as they understood it. And in this, the demiurge becomes drunk with power, in trying to simulate the spirit realm in the material plane, and believing that it is the end all be all of all things. And Sophia registers this and goes to the higher eternals and goes to Christos and goes to the higher archons, and admits what she did and what has happened, the creation of the demiurge and what the demiurge is doing. And so they start to plot a way to return the divine light that the demiurge has to the pleroma. So this is the end of Act 2. And at this point into Act 3, we'll start to recognize it more, because in Act 3, we're going to start getting to Genesis, the events that we understand as Genesis. So in Act 3, with this kind of arrogant proclamation, the demiurge makes the statement, "For my part, I am a jealous God, and there is no other God apart from me." And for those of you that know scripture of Judaism, this is very familiar. And because of this statements, the archons that were created, again, the entities that embody the constellations and the planets, they became suspicious. Because if the demiurge was the only true God, then what would that God be jealous of? And so with this, the higher eternals in the spirit realm, they took the celestial Adam, as we mentioned, the true embodiment of man, and brought it to the edge of the veil so that its luminous image would be reflected into the waters of space-time. Um, and with this, the demiurge trembled, and the foundations of the abyss shook, and the archons were dumbfounded. And so, thinking quickly, the demiurge in his envy said to create a human. So, this is the quote, as we've heard it before: "Come, let us make a human being after the image of God, and after our own images, so that the human being's image might serve us as a light. Let us call him Adam, so that we might have his name as a luminous power." So this is kind of like a strange Frankenstein's monster kind of vibe to it, where they're trying to remake something in their own that they have no part in making, which was kind of the fault of Sophia to begin with. So they moved to create this vessel, and the body would not live, um, because they don't. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. The body would not live. So, as part of the plan that was cooked up by the higher Pleroma, the Barbalo dispatches Christos and the four luminaries to whisper in the ear of the demiurge that he should breathe life into Adam. And so he did. He was fooled into doing so. And this was the divine light of Sophia, and that is the light that gives life, the vita, the vitality, consciousness. And so he gave this light to Adam. And so thus Adam was stronger and beyond uh, the demiurge and all of the archons. And of course, they moved to retaliate quickly. And so they cast Adam into the lowest pit of matter. And the Barbalo moved to dispatch the son of Sophia to reside with him. The son of Sophia, she would be, or the daughter of Sophia, I mean, was Zoe. And this would be come to understand as Eve. So Eve's creation was viewed as completely independent and was actually of the higher, from the higher realm into the material plane. So this is where the Gnostics get the concept of a material prison. They wanted to create a prison for Adam, so that he would not usurp their whole order. So a body of matter was created from the dust of the earth, or from clay, if you're taking it again from scripture, uh, which Adam's soul was to be imprisoned in. And the same was done for Eve. Uh, Furthermore, the Garden of Eden was, in this context, in the Gnostic context, a place of complacency and unperceptiveness, a place that was made for them to be asleep, as to not awaken the gnosis in Adam, a place of leisure and earthly delight, and so that he would have no clue as to his inner power and how to use it. And so the only rule, and again, we recognize this, the only rule the demiurge gave him was that he should never touch the tree of knowledge, or the tree of gnosis. And then, of course, would understand his godhood and would defeat the demiurge and the host of rulers. And so this is one of the last interventions, is the higher Christos, as was mentioned in the Pleroma, is descended into the Garden Eden in the form of a serpent. So you can see already how they've managed to flip the story of Christianity completely around. So in this case, the serpent is the good guy and actually is Christos. So I don't know, it's an interesting twist, and you can see why mainstream Christianity found this as the greatest heresy. And mind you, if you look up Gnosticism, most of what you're going to find is still to this day this vehement hatred of Gnosticism. So it was the serpent. And in our discussion last week of the celestial hierarchy, we mentioned that the Sephirim, the highest angels, were serpents. They were fiery serpents. So this again is another way that we can kind of flip the idea of what serpents are in the understanding of religiosity. And so we know that the serpent convinces that they should eat from the fruit of the tree, and so that they should know good and evil. And this is their realization of their own power and liberation from material darkness, from the material world. And so, again, moving quickly, the demiurge expels Adam and Eve from the garden and cursed the earth, the woman, and the serpent. So that's why we have a false understanding of the serpent and ourselves, is because of the demiurge's curse that was made at this time of splitting from the Garden of Eden. And that the two humans were given the waters of forgetfulness. So again, this is straight out of the afterlife, or the pre-life that is understood by the Greeks, that they would drink from the waters of Lethe to forget. So they were given the waters of forgetfulness, and so that they wouldn't remember who they were, and that they wouldn't, and that they would kind of be brainwashed into this aspect of the man was set to dominate the woman. And in this, they were blinded by their own sins and to the existence of the greater God, the parents, the father mother aspect in the pleroma, and they would be only convinced of what is here with them, and that would be the demiurge and the archons. So a kind of side note here is one of the archons, all these names are really hard. So one of the archons made by the demiurge, Sabaoth, eventually repented and condemned the ways of his father, the demiurge, and sang praises to Sophia so that he could be lifted into the nearest place to the pleroma. And so in this, Sabaoth became the god of the Jews. So there's, in this way, the way the Gnostics look at the Old Testament, there was both the God that was referred to, the God that is like Yahweh, which is the demiurge, and then there was Sabaoth, and they were both intervening. So where the demiurge appears in the Old Testament is all of the acts of punishment and hatred. And Sabaoth would have been the kind of redeeming God of the Old Testament. So this explains the kind of contradiction in the mythos of the Old Testament. So one was not as arrogant, and one was completely arrogant. So the one that wished to ensue the deluge was the demiurge, and the one who warned and allowed them to prepare for the deluge was Sabaoth. And so you can see that they're acting against each other in this way. So this is where it's come to, that humanity had its beginning, and as a lost people unaware of its divine origins. Again, the origin is in the pleroma. And so we have awakened onto the earth at this point, unaware of where we are, of who we are, and where we come from. And that's something that is very real to us, right? Like, you don't, most of the time people walk around and everyone's just going about their duties. But if you ask anybody where we come from, then we can get this kind of scientism aspect where, say that we come from monkeys and then we came from fish, but there's just this kind of missing aspect to this. And this is the explanation of the Gnostics, is that we do know, but we've been made to forget. So in this way, the Gnostics view the whole story as us trying to return the stolen light of Sophia to its rightful home in the pleroma. And again, the light is our consciousness, is our ability to care, to be understood, to supersede the material, the mind over matter, that kind of power within us. However, we have been imprisoned by these archons and by the demiurge to physical incarnation, the prison of physical incarnation. So again, this sounds like the Greeks in their concept of the grieving cycle, and this also sounds like samsara, which is, you know, the Buddhist understanding of this, and that this cycle will continue forever until the soul awakens and escapes what they call the wheels of fate. So same story, different twist. Um, And in this last section of the third act, the demiurge is actually banished by Sophia and Zoe, that her daughter, to Tartarus, which is another interesting twist, because Tartarus was the underworld in the Greek conception, but then in the Christian understanding, this would be referred to as Satan, and into hell, where the population was a world of demons, of envy and death. So you can see, like what I've said from the beginning, that this is an interesting mishmash of all of these things put together. And by the Gnostic interpretation, when you were to see Lucifer, that would actually be the aspect of Christos, because that would be Lucifer, would be the light bearer or the light bringer, and that would be the Christos. Whereas actual Satan would be the God of the Old Testament later. And since we don't see Satan as much until really later in the canonical Bible, that this is the point where the demiurge is made into Satan and rules over hell. And Act 4, I'm not really going to get into, because I realize that I'm spending most of my time here on the cosmogeny of everything. And Act 4 is essentially the story of Jesus's return and what that was all about. And so this is where I get back to what I mentioned in the beginning of the text that was found, the Gospel of Judas. As the Gnostics understand it, the passions and the crucifixion of Jesus on earth was intended to separate the pure from within him and to destroy the impure. So again, they view all of material as evil, being that it was created by the demiurge. And Christos descended into the material plane and became embodied. So the act of dying was to separate the material evil from his pure beinghood, to remember. And so Judas, in truly knowing who he was, again, is the hero of this tale, allowing himself to be martyred and to be viewed as the betrayer in order to bring Jesus to that pure form that needed to happen. That was a part of the divine plan from the pleroma. So that's the Act 4. And this leaves the Gnostic story with it as they were practicing, in the centuries past, in early AD. The story was that we would continue to slowly bring the light through Gnosticism, through gnosis, through understanding, through enlightenment, back to the pleroma through time. And essentially, we would eventually return all of the divine light that was stolen from Sophia by the demiurge to the pleroma, and that would leave the void in the void, and it would basically be nothingness, and we would be returned to our rightful place in the pleroma. And to kind of dive into this a little bit more philosophically, this is a way of explaining this feeling in humanity of something never quite being right, of something never completely being full, of us always striving and trying to find something, to never quite have a true home. And this, to the Gnostics, would be because this is not our home, and that we should do everything that we can to escape it. So they disagreed in many ways as to how this was done. they wished to become completely celibate, as to not create any more life, as this way it would not spread the light even further. And then they disagreed so much with that too. So, well, okay, either they be completely celibate or they viewed any acts that could lead to conception as a sin. Um, or there was the opposite camp. So the first camp was like the Cathars. The Cathars were ones that didn't practice anything like that. And then there's the opposite camp to say that we are the celestial atom and that we are greater than the material worlds. So thus we can do whatever we please, and that we will take over this place by the very quality of our character through time. So there's a lot of disagreements as to how do we go from here? How do we return the light? How do we return to the home? Now, before I kind of dissect that a little bit more, um, I want to just mention that, this might seem very strange to us. This might seem like it's very unrecognizable to the mainstream culture, but you see it. Well, for one, there's plenty of churches that exist now of Gnosticism. There's the Ecclesia Gnostica. There's the Johannite Church. There's the Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica. There's the Gnostic Church of France and the North American College of Gnostic Bishops. And then you have all sorts of writers that have kind of made this resurgence. And Madame Blavatsky, of course, is a big one. And so is J.R.S. Mead. But they're the ones that are associated with this theosophical movement, which has also been closely tied to Gnosticism. And of course, I'll probably have to touch on the Theosophists at some point. The other big one was Carl Jung, and he kind of gets a lot of that credit in kind of reviving certain concepts of Gnosticism. Now, it's an interesting thing to think of how any of them really knew, because of like I said before, the library that we discovered, the Nag Hammadi, came out in 1945, and the Gospel of Judas came out later. And so, or resurfaced later, I should say. So for Madame Blavatsky and Carl Jung to be familiar with this stuff seemed like it would have only passed through sort of secret school type of knowledge, through spoken traditions that have lasted since the BCs. We also see it, aspects of Gnosticism used in all sorts of storytelling. So in books, it's like the Valis trilogy, or Valis trilogy, the Blood Meridian, A Little World Made Cunningly, or in films and video games. So there's like the Xenoblade Chronicles, there's Xenogears, the Xenosaga, and the big one that people recognize is The Matrix. That The Matrix was really inspired based off of this Gnostic literature, the idea of the human mind being encapsulated in a sort of simulation and being in reality exploited for some aspect of its existence. And the great ones that really hammer this home, which I just got done watching this, is Neo-Genesis Evangelion and Ghost in the Shell, which are more of the anime end of things. So in this case, it's not something that's utterly foreign. We actually see it in some of the literature, but that doesn't mean that we acknowledge it. So neo-Gnosticism, as it stands nowadays, is mostly interested in this interpretation of the matrix, or the simulation theory. This has become more popular, especially among like quantum physicists and so forth, or those that are really into computers. The idea that it's all a sort of simulation, and the kind of dissolving of our priorities in this life accordingly, that we are trapped in some sort of cube, and that there's seemingly no way of escaping it. Now, I feel like personally, a big reason why Gnosticism has really been brought back, neo-Gnosticism, why it's been a topic in counterculture, is because of these feelings that we have in the modern day of existentialism and nihilism and abandonment and alienation from the material world. And so we tend to be more like defeatist Gnostics, whereas the true Gnostics in the olden times would have done. They wouldn't have just felt like they are trapped. They would have been doing things in this world to, through discipline and asceticism, would be aspiring to escape the wheel. They would have some sort of hope tied to that despair. But in its understanding of, neo-Gnosticism, it's just this despair. And I feel like the reason it's become that kind of hot topic is because of this religion, so to speak, this spiritual belief that makes our despair and makes our feelings of abandonment rational into a religious context. And for those that have taken neo-Gnosticism even further, they wish to say that the archons of the demiurge are actually extraterrestrials, that they're aliens. And so the greys and the reptilian shapeshifters were apparently described by these texts, making them seem like the embodiments of the archons. And so in that way we have, and just in this conception, these extraterrestrial entities of higher technological capabilities actively engaging in our world, trying to keep the human psyche at a lower vibration and trying to feed off of the fear and the nihilism and the darkness of everything. So this where does this leave us? So there's a few interesting points to take from this. One, we can understand why Christianity was so appalled by Gnosticism. For one, the Cathars were the sorts that would not eat meat. They would not kill anything. They would not be harmful to anything. And if we, remember what mainstream Christianity became, it was very interested in murder and general cheating in order to gain power. So this, the Gnostics of the Cathars would have been this type of like, you're too much of a goody-goody, to have around. And the fact that they believed that the God of the Old Testament was this demiurge was just a kick to the pants, and that the serpent was, Christos. That's clearly blasphemy. And it's that kind of thing that human beings have always had, that we hate our neighbors more than we hate anybody else. And me coming from Minnesota, I always think of the Green Bay Packers and the Vikings. It's just like this thing where you can't hate that one that's that far away, because what you hate are the minute differences. So the reason why Gnosticism really got swept under the rug and why there was a sort of genocide that went down was for this reason, that they were a direct challenge to the power that the establishment of the church wanted to make. Now, the other thing that we should be mindful of is the state of early Christianity was a truly anarchic phase, that this was not, it was not all decided from the beginning. What books would go in and what books wouldn't go in was a very organic debate that continued through time. And eventually codified into what we understand it is now. But in this early phase, there was a lot of different understandings of the alleged experience of Christ on earth, of the experience of the crucifixion and so forth. What do we think about this? How do we rationalize this? What things did John and these apostles actually say? And in these texts, like I said, a lot of this all the Acts and the Gnostic cosmology I'm giving you was allegedly written by John, the Apocryphon of John. So the Gnostics would be the ones to say that you have hidden crucial evidence, that you have taken out crucial texts to actually understand this. And so the Gnostics would be convinced that the Christians, as we call them, are of the greatest heresy for flipping the truth on its head in this way, and of not discussing the greater fabric of the universe. And so another interesting observation here too is that in this conception by the Gnostics, there is the God of like Judaism, the one that we should not speak of, that there is no true name for, because it is the totality of allness, and that is the God. Whereas we also have other aspects of these higher archons, um, and the demiurgus archons that embody what could be understood as the Greek pantheon. So it's also giving room for aspects of astrology controlling people's lives, because that's what the archons do. They control the wheels of fate. Um, and so it's not shoving any other scriptures to the side when the Gnostics are creating this greater story. It's actually being all inclusive. And so this would have stood, well, for one, this is extra fascinating, right? Like, to say that they sent the demiurge to Tartarus being a Greek thing is just that kind of interesting tidbit alone. But it's just also to say that that's what made it an even greater threat to the church, was because of this inclusiveness. Now, a lot of the reason why there wasn't a lot of fight back is because, like I said, the Gnostics did not believe in reproducing a lot of the time. And even though if they did practice sexually, the only way that they would continue was through recruitment. Um, Whereas, as we all know, Christians are very able to reproduce, provided that it's under the right conditions, of course. Uh, but this would have put them at a disadvantage when it comes to power plays, when it comes to that kind of battleground that was the forming of different religions in Europe. Um, Another last note that I want to touch on again is that the the fascination and the resurgence of Gnosticism in the modern day, I find, is very interesting. It's affecting many different religions in different kinds of ways, and I feel like just the fact that we're even speaking the name of it alone shows how much more, in my mind, how much more aware the world is now than it would have been, say, 100 years ago. There are beliefs that are resurfacing from literally being buried in our modern day. And I think that we ought to be grateful for that, because it shows that we're kind of really bathing in the very complex truth of history, that it's not as simple as we thought it was, that there's a lot more to the story than we could have imagined. Now, when it comes to, if we were to actually believe in Gnosticism, if we were to kind of buy into it more, then it would essentially put us on the same path as taking Buddhism very seriously would. That is to generally not reproduce. That is to generally be an ascetic, and to practice self-discipline, and to practice meditation and all aspects of being healthy and mindfulness, um, and do your damnedest to escape the wheel and join the true fulfillment of where we originate from. And I feel like when you put it in those terms, it really doesn't seem that foreign to say that if any of us were to believe in the spirit, or the greatest part of ourself, the archetypal self, or the self with the capital S, the self that watches us do all the things and isn't the one doing all the things, that this is the part of us that we know would be most capable of actually being fulfilled. And in this idea, it's just to say that there is a place for that self. There is somewhere to go, but we are, for this time, to be lost here. The other thing that I didn't mention, that I think is a good point, especially if anybody wants to look into it a little bit more, is that the Gnostics really put a lot of emphasis on Seth, which is one of the first sons of the Bible, versus Cain. So we would be viewed as different ancestors. And like I mentioned before, there were three types of humans: the humans of the body, the humans of the psyche, and the humans of the spirit. And so these would be viewed as all the different lineages from those first humans. So Cain's would have been the earthly ones, the ones that will not seek to achieve gnosis. Um, I think it's Abel's children who would be the ones that are the psychics, the ones that are capable of achieving gnosis, but aren't quite the full push yet. And then the sons of Seth would be the Sethians, and these would be the ones that are the nearest to seeking gnosis or full enlightenment or escaping the grievous wheel. um, and in this way too, it's interesting for us to look at, because if you are a very conscious person, say you've never really been one to identify a lot with what's been going on in the world, whether that's calling yourself a specific religion, or calling yourself a specific political belief, or labeling yourself in specific ways, because you as a person have always felt very conscientious of everything that's going on and the downfalls of leaning too far to one side or the other, and have been one of this kind of adaptiveness and one of like really always pushing yourself to be the greatest person you can be. This would be what would be viewed as the Gnostics as a Sethian, one who is the most capable of reaching gnosis. And if you're like this, then maybe you're one that really tends towards deeper conversation. And sometimes there are those people that you can have those deeper conversations with if you kind of work with them a little bit. And these would be the psychics. These would be the ones that are near it. They're near it. They're teasing with it. And then sometimes maybe you meet those few people that really hit it home with you and that you can talk with endlessly about these kind of aspects. And these would be other Gnostics or other spirits. Whereas the last one would be those, and you already know where I'm going with this, those that you would be most frustrated with. So those that you think that are purely convinced of the material world. So it's all about sensory pleasure. It's all about whatever I can get. It's all about whoever dies with the most toys wins. It's always about whoever is the king of this absurd nihilistic world type of mentality. The ones that are only convinced of this and that have no interest in spiritual faculties, the Gnostics would discern them as the sons of Cain. So in that way, or the earthly ones. In that way, Gnosticism is also giving an explanation as to this feeling of different types of people being on the same earth, of different lineages of people, and only and different ways of distinguishing ourselves. And mind you, it's not taking that kind of classic Christian approach where it says those that were born from Cain are eternally doomed. It just says that they will be the last ones to go. So it's not this kind of recognized hatred that we might be used to seeing in that kind of classic Christianity, or that domineering Christianity. It's just to say that in returning the light to the pleroma, or in returning to our home, to put it most succinctly, the Gnostics will be the first ones to go, the psychics will be the second, and the sons of Cain would be the last. Um, so with that, I've already taken up basically an hour. Uh, we're not going to stick with Christianity any further yet. Doing the celestial hierarchy and Gnosticism has really been a kind of a real dance around the mysticism of Christianity. And eventually we'll come back to it some more with discussions of hermetics and probably some more discussion of the more deep knit aspects of Gnosticism and the early church and all the formations there. From this point, we're going to start moving towards Taoism and some of the Eastern traditions. And eventually we're going to kind of work it back into the Western traditions and start to mix these all around with the New Age. So for those that are here and those that have stuck, I appreciate you sticking around. I'm going to stop the